Hey guys, welcome back to Boring History for Sleep. Tonight, we're stepping into Tudor England, a world of candlelight, court gossip, and a surprising amount of beheadings. Don't worry though, we'll go slow, no loud fanfares, no sharp swords swinging past your ears. Just the quiet, slightly terrifying rise of one red-haired girl who would one day rule a kingdom that didn't even want her in the first place. Her name was Elizabeth. Now, before she became the Virgin Queen, before portraits painted her in white lace and golden halos, she was just a small, serious child in a cold palace, trying to figure out why the grown-ups kept whispering every time her name came up. Because, honestly, being Henry VIII's daughter wasn't exactly a peaceful start to life. Henry VIII, if you've somehow slept through him already, was that king who basically turned divorce into a national hobby. He wanted a son so badly he split from the Catholic Church, started a whole new religion, and still couldn't stop marrying like he was speedrunning Tinder for royals. When Elizabeth was born in 1533, everyone was expecting a boy. Courtiers had already planned the celebrations, banners, feasts, the works. And then, surprise, out came a girl. The silence in the delivery room probably said it all. Henry tried to smile through it. Ah yes, a daughter. That's fine too. For now, but the disappointment hung in the air like bad perfume. Still, Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, was confident. She believed her daughter would be great. Anne herself was clever, sharp-tongued, and far too modern for the 1500s. Basically, a Tudor woman who thought she could play politics on equal footing with men. Spoiler, that didn't end well. By the time Elizabeth was just 3, her mother had been executed, accused of adultery, witchcraft, and, because it was Tudor England, just about anything else they could throw on the pile. Elizabeth went from princess to the king's illegitimate daughter overnight. Her royal clothes were taken away, her servants dismissed, and she was quietly moved out of the palace, like an unwanted reminder of Henry's bad marriage. So picture this, a little girl, maybe red curls tangled, trying to hold her chin high like she'd seen her mother do, living in the countryside with a small household, knowing that half of England thought she shouldn't exist. That's how our story begins. But Elizabeth wasn't ordinary, even as a child. She was frighteningly intelligent, the kind of kid who could memorize entire Latin passages just to impress her tutors. While other children were learning to ride ponies, Elizabeth was writing letters in Latin and Greek, and casually quoting philosophers like it was gossip. She was sharp, curious, and already suspicious of everyone around her, which, in Tudor court life, was the best survival skill anyone could have. Her half-sister, Mary, later known as Bloody Mary, was older, Catholic, and very aware that Elizabeth was the Protestant problem child of their father's messy love life. Their relationship would become complicated, but we'll get there. For now, think of them as two girls, both royal, both born into a game they didn't agree to play. As Elizabeth grew, she learned early that affection at court could vanish faster than a candle flame. One moment, you're a princess eating sugared almonds. The next, you're a lady politely ignored by everyone at dinner. She saw what ambition could do. Her mother had been ambitious, and look how that ended. So Elizabeth decided something quietly brilliant. She would learn everything, say little, and wait. Her tutors adored her. Roger Ascham, her famous teacher, once said Elizabeth's mind was like lightning, quick, bright, and impossible to catch. She loved languages, history, philosophy, anything that gave her power without drawing attention. Because, in her world, knowledge was the one thing no one could take away. But life still wasn't peaceful. Her father, Henry, went through wives like costume changes, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, Catherine Parr, and each new queen shifted Elizabeth's fortunes again. One day she'd be welcomed back to court. The next, she'd be packed off again, depending on whether the new stepmother liked her. Imagine growing up never knowing if your next letter from the palace meant a royal visit or a quiet exile. Still, somehow, Elizabeth kept her head, literally and figuratively. She watched, learned, and never forgot how fast things could change. And when her father finally died, leaving the throne to her sickly half-brother Edward VI, she didn't celebrate, she waited again. Because if you were smart in Tudor England, you didn't grab power, you let everyone else fight for it first. Edward's short reign was all about religion, Protestant reforms, book burnings, and a lot of people pretending to agree with him to stay alive. Elizabeth kept her head down. She practiced diplomacy the way others practiced archery. She smiled, nodded, said the right prayers, and quietly counted the days. But when Edward died young, and her half-sister Mary took the throne, Elizabeth's calm life vanished again. Mary, the devout Catholic, saw Elizabeth as the Protestant threat, a symbol for rebels who wanted England to turn back to the new faith. And poor Elizabeth, who probably just wanted to read a book and take a nap, suddenly found herself locked up in the Tower of London, accused of treason. Imagine that moment, walking through the Tower gates, where your own mother had been executed, hearing the heavy doors close behind you. She was 20 years old, alone, and completely at the mercy of her sister. If she slept at all that night, it was probably with one eye open. But Elizabeth didn't cry or beg. Instead, she played the same quiet game she'd learned as a child: patience, politeness, and perfect timing. She wrote letters to Mary that balanced between loyalty and self-defense, never saying too much, never too little. And, miraculously, it worked. After a few months, she was released, pale, thinner, but alive. That tower changed her forever. From that day on, Elizabeth knew exactly what kind of queen she'd be, the kind who smiled in public, listened in silence, and struck only when it mattered. Fear wasn't something she wanted, it was something she learned to use. And that's how the girl who wasn't supposed to matter, the unwanted daughter of a disgraced queen, began her slow, careful climb toward becoming the most feared ruler in England's history. So, let's dim the lights a little more. In the next part, we'll follow Elizabeth as she steps out of the tower, a free woman in a dangerous world, and begins to build the image that would one day make her untouchable. But for now, close your eyes. Imagine the cold stone walls of the tower fading into the morning light. The red-haired girl walks away, quiet, calm, and already planning her next move. Sleep well, we're just getting started. So Elizabeth walks out of the tower. The heavy wooden doors close behind her with that slow, echoing sound that probably stayed in her memory forever. Thunk, ... a noise that meant survival. She wasn't a queen yet, not even close. At this point, she was just a royal inconvenience, too famous to kill, too dangerous to trust, and too smart to underestimate. Mary Tudor, her half-sister, still sat on the throne, and Mary was tired. Tired of rebellions, tired of being called Bloody Mary, and definitely tired of people whispering that maybe Elizabeth should be queen instead. Elizabeth, on the other hand, was tired in a different way, the kind of exhaustion that comes from pretending to be harmless all the time. But she kept pretending, because that was her greatest weapon. After being released, Elizabeth was technically under house arrest. Imagine living in a country house, surrounded by guards who smiled too much and never left you alone. Her letters were read before they left her hands. Her visitors were approved by the crown. Even her meals were probably tasted before she got to them. Tudor life was nothing if not paranoid. Still, Elizabeth played the part. She wrote polite letters to her sister, thanking her for mercy. She attended mass, bowed when expected, and gave nothing away. But every night, behind the embroidered curtains of her room, she studied, wrote, and planned. You can almost imagine her candlelight flickering over pages of Latin notes, her quill moving steadily while everyone else slept. If history were a game of chess, Elizabeth was the queen piece learning how to move before the board even existed. Meanwhile, Mary's rule was burning itself out, literally. The religious persecutions, the executions of Protestants, the failed marriage alliance with Spain. Everything was falling apart, and England was scared of its queen, of God, of what might come next. They started to look again at Elizabeth, the quiet one, the survivor. Mary could sense it. You can almost picture her at night, restless, pacing her chamber, knowing that somewhere out there, her sister was waiting. But fate, as always, didn't need Elizabeth to act. It did the job for her. In November 1558, Queen Mary I died, and with that single moment, everything changed. Elizabeth was She was at Hatfield House when she heard the news, surrounded by a handful of servants and courtiers, who suddenly realized they were standing in front of the new ruler of England. Someone knelt. Someone else whispered, "God save the Queen." And for a brief moment, Elizabeth said nothing. There's an old story, maybe true, maybe legend, that when she heard Mary was dead, Elizabeth looked up at the sky and said softly, "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." A perfect mix of relief, reverence, and quiet triumph. But let's be honest, she was probably also thinking, finally, From that moment, the careful, cautious girl transformed into something else entirely. Not instantly, but you could feel the shift. All those years of fear, study, and patience had built her into someone England didn't quite know how to handle. When she rode into London to be crowned, people flooded the streets. They hadn't had a queen they could cheer for in years. One who smiled, waved, and actually looked like she believed she could fix things. Her coronation in January 1559 was a spectacle of gold and red, banners fluttering in the cold winter air, bells ringing for miles. But beneath all that glitter was a storm of pressure. The kingdom she inherited was a mess, bankrupt, divided by religion, threatened by France and Spain, and run by men who didn't exactly love the idea of a young woman telling them what to do. So Elizabeth did what she always did best. She pretended. In public, she was all grace and smiles, the picture of royal calm. In private, she calculated every word, every alliance, every risk. She chose her counselors carefully, people like William Cecil, who had been loyal but not foolish. She trusted no one completely, but she listened to everyone. One of her first acts as queen was to restore Protestantism, but gently. She wasn't interested in more burnings or blood. She knew England was tired of extremes. So instead of forcing people to believe, she allowed just enough flexibility to keep the peace. It wasn't kindness, it was strategy, and it worked. Her court quickly became one of the most vibrant places in Europe, full of poets, explorers, spies, and schemers. The air smelled of ink, candle wax, and ambition. Men wrote sonnets in her honor, calling her a goddess, a muse, a savior, and Elizabeth. She smiled and accepted it all, fully aware that it was power disguised as flattery. The question everyone wanted to ask was the same: would she marry? Because, to the nobles, a queen without a husband meant danger, a kingdom without an heir, and possibly chaos. Elizabeth played that question like a master musician tuning her instrument. She flirted with the idea. She entertained suitors, princes from France, archdukes from Austria, even the young king of Sweden. She laughed at their compliments, danced at their feasts, and sent them home politely with nothing but hope. It wasn't that she hated marriage. She just didn't trust what came with it. She'd seen what men in power could do to women, her mother, her stepmothers, even her sister Mary. Love, to her, looked like a trap. So she turned the idea of the Virgin Queen into a brand before branding was even a thing. Her unmarried status became a symbol. She was married to England, loyal to her people, and beholden to no man. And honestly, it worked better than any love story could. But not everyone was happy. There were Catholic plots, foreign threats, whispers of rebellion. Some wanted Mary, Queen of Scots, on the throne instead, a Catholic rival who became Elizabeth's most dangerous mirror. The two women never met, but their lives tangled like vines in a dark garden. We'll get there soon, because that rivalry will shape the rest of Elizabeth's reign. Elizabeth sitting by the window in the glow of candlelight, her court buzzing behind her, letters and reports stacked high on her desk. She's reading, thinking, always a step ahead. Outside, England sleeps, safer than it's been in years, but its queen is still awake, already plotting how to make her kingdom strong enough that no one will ever dare lock her away again. The girl from the tower was gone, and she was just getting started. The palace lights are dimming, the fire crackles, and we'll continue this story soon, when enemies rise, alliances twist, and Elizabeth proves that fear, when wielded carefully, can keep a crown from falling. The first years of Elizabeth's reign looked calm enough on the surface. Bells rang, coins were minted with her face, poets compared her to the dawn, but underneath, the kingdom felt like a glass of wine set on a shaky table. One bad tremor, and everything could spill. Religion was the tremor. Half of England wanted to keep the old Catholic wise incense, Latin prayers, and priests who looked like they'd stepped straight out of a medieval painting. The other half wanted plain churches, plain hymns, and sermons that sounded like angry farmers shouting scripture. Elizabeth needed both sides to stay quiet, at least until she could pay off her father's debts and make England look less like a sinking ship. So she did the cleverest thing: she annoyed everyone equally. Her new settlement said, basically, believe what you want at home, but in public, act polite and don't start riots. It was religious genius, disguised as mild irritation. Priests grumbled, nobles sighed, but the streets stayed mostly command. That, for Elizabeth, was victory. Still, peace didn't mean safety. Across the water in France, a young queen was watching her, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, beautiful, Catholic, and technically next in line to the English throne. Foreign ambassadors whispered that she, not Elizabeth, was the rightful queen. And in the quiet of her court, Elizabeth must have felt that whisper turning into a chill. She couldn't attack Mary outright. It would look cruel, unchristian, very Instead, she smiled in public and unleashed her favorite weapon in private: spies. Sir Francis Walsingham, the man who could probably read your diary before you'd de-written it, became her eyes and ears. He planted informers in taverns, churches, even in the homes of noblemen who looked too relaxed. If Elizabeth's England had a heartbeat, Walsingham could feel it from miles away. While spies scribbled in candlelight, courtiers filled the palace with another kind of tension: marriage gossip. Every noble thought they knew who the queen should marry. Some wanted her to pick an English noble to keep things local. Others insisted she needed a foreign prince to keep the peace. Elizabeth just smiled and changed the subject again, and again. 4 years. Her favorite candidate, or at least the one everyone thought might have a chance, was Robert Dudley, the handsome, daring master of the horse. They'd grown up together, shared jokes, maybe even shared glances that lasted a little too long. The court buzzed with rumors, and ambassadors rode back to Spain and France, with scandal in every sentence. But then Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart, died suddenly after falling down a staircase. Tragic, yes. Convenient. A bit too much. Even if Elizabeth had nothing to do with it, and there's no proof she did, the gossip burned hot enough to melt the idea of marriage. After that, she learned to use romance as a tool, not a weakness. She flirted with kings and courtiers like a cat with a feather, just enough to keep alliances warm but never enough to get trapped. England was her husband now, and the people, well, they were the kind of in-laws you could never escape. Meanwhile, the outside world was getting louder. Spain, ruled by King Philip II, the same man who'd once been married to her sister Mary, was glaring at England across the sea. He didn't like Protestants. He didn't like female rulers. And he really didn't like Elizabeth telling pirates to explore his trade routes. He called them criminals. Elizabeth called them privateers. It was the kind of word that made stealing sound patriotic. Among those privateers was a young, ambitious sailor named Francis Drake. He raided Spanish ships, brought back gold, and bowed low before the Queen, while still smelling faintly of gunpowder and salt water. Elizabeth adored him not as a man, but as a symbol. Every chest of stolen treasure he brought home made her look stronger and Philip angrier. It was perfect. But anger has a way of growing quietly, like smoke before a fire. The more Elizabeth smiled, the more Europe plotted. The Pope excommunicated her, declaring that any Catholic who killed her would earn a one-way ticket to heaven. That's the kind of decree that keeps a queen awake at night. So the walls of her palaces grew thicker, her guards sharper, her trusts smaller. Even her portraits changed. Early on, she'd been painted soft and human. Now, her artists gave her ageless skin, wide eyes, and dresses so ornate they looked like armor. It wasn't vanity, it was camouflage. The Virgin Queen wasn't meant to look mortal. She was England itself, untouchable, shining, a little terrifying. And yet, alone in her chambers, the woman under all that lace must have still remembered the tower, the cold floors, the locked doors, the silence. Every decision she made carried that echo. She'd survived once by pretending to be harmless. Now she survived by pretending to be divine. The balancing act was endless. Too harsh, and her people would fear her like they feared her sister. Too soft, and the men around her would try to rule for her. So she perfected something in between, authority wrapped in charm. She laughed at jokes she didn't find funny, scolded with a smile, rewarded loyalty with gold, and punished betrayal so quietly that most men didn't realize they'd lost until it was too late. At night, she walked the galleries of her palaces, unable to sleep, candles flickering over portraits of her family, the father who'd killed for a son, the mother who'd died for ambition, the sister who'd locked her away. And maybe, in those hours, she whispered to herself, "You survived them all. Don't stop now." Outside, London slept. Merchants dreamed of profit, sailors dreamed of land, and poets dreamed of queens who never aged. Somewhere, in Scotland, Mary Stuart dreamed of England. To Anne that dream would soon become a nightmare. Neither of them could escape. So breathe out. The air smells of wax and rain. The Queen sits at her desk, quill in hand, eyes tired but steady. Another letter to sign, another secret to hide, another night without peace. In the next part, we'll follow Elizabeth as Mary, Queen of Scots' story collides with Hearst's plots unravel. Executions loom, and the Virgin Queen learns how fear can rule a nation better than love. For now, close your eyes. The sea outside England's shores is whispering already, ships waiting for orders that will change history. But we'll get to that after you've had a little sleep. Mary, Queen of Scots, arrived in England like a guest who would never leave. She was 25, tall, graceful, and glowing with the kind of beauty that made poets write too much. After her own subjects in Scotland turned against her, Mary fled across the border, expecting cousin Elizabeth to offer sympathy, maybe even help. Elizabeth welcomed her with letters full of dear cousin and royal affection, then promptly arranged for guards, locked doors, and a steady rotation of suspicious hosts. Because here's the thing, Mary wasn't just a queen in trouble, she was a queen with a claim to Elizabeth's throne. Many Catholics believed that Mary, not Elizabeth, was the rightful ruler of England. So Elizabeth kept her safe, and very far away. Not in a cell, exactly. Mary had servants, meals, embroidery, but every view from her window ended with walls. At first, Elizabeth didn't want Mary's death. She wanted this whole cousin situation to fade like a bad rumor. But politics has a way of knocking on the door no matter how many guards you post outside. Two noblemen, Catholic and overconfident, decided they'd rescue Mary, overthrow Elizabeth, and restore England to the old faith. It sounded heroic in their heads. More plots followed, each one more tangled than the last. The Ridolfi plot, the Throckmorton plot, and finally the Babington plot, all centered around one idea: kill Elizabeth, put Mary on the throne, restore Catholic rule. And behind each scheme, like a ghostly hand on the curtain, stood foreign powers: Spain, France, even the Pope himself. England had become the center of a giant, anxious chessboard, and Elizabeth was the piece everyone wanted to knock over. He built a network of informants that stretched across Europe. Letters were intercepted, codes broken, invisible ink revealed in candlelight. When one of those coded letters finally proved that Mary herself had approved a plan to assassinate Elizabeth, Walsingham brought it straight to the Queen. The cousin she'd half pitied, half feared, had become a clear threat. She signed Mary's death warrant, then tried to unsign it. Because somewhere deep down, Elizabeth remembered being that young, unwanted princess watching her mother die. She knew exactly what a scaffold meant. Her council, tired of waiting, carried out the execution without waiting for her final word. On a cold February morning in 1587, Mary was led to the block.com and composed. The axe fell cleanly, and with it, one of Elizabeth's last illusions of safety. When the news reached her, Elizabeth was furious, or at least, she said she was. She shouted, wept, locked herself away. Because with Mary dead, the story of England shifted again. The Pope called for vengeance, and King Philip of Spain began to plan what would become the most famous invasion attempt of the century, the Spanish Armada. But that's a story still gathering on the horizon, a fleet of sails in the mist. For now, Elizabeth's England stood at a strange crossroads. Her image as the Virgin Queen was now complete, independent, holy, untouchable. She started to wear her hair high, powdered, and red like a halo. Her dresses became heavy with pearls and symbols, eyes and ears embroidered into the fabric to remind everyone that nothing escaped her notice. She was turning into an icon before anyone invented the word. Behind all that glory, though, the years were starting to weigh on her. Her beloved Robert Dudley had died, leaving her a letter she kept beside her bed until her own death. Her court had become a carousel of younger faces, louder voices, endless flattery. And though she still danced, still joked, the laughter came slower now. In the quiet of her chamber, Elizabeth began to talk to portraits, her mother's, her father's, even her own. She would trace the lines of paint, stare into her own younger face, and whisper things history would never hear. The Virgin Queen had built a kingdom of fear and admiration, but even she couldn't outwit time. Every morning she rose earlier than her ladies, dressed longer, spoke stronger. If age wanted to creep in, it would have to get past the armor of lace and pride she wore every day. Outside, London glowed brighter than ever, trade booming, theatres alive with laughter, explorers returning from lands no one had mapped yet. This was the Elizabethan age, a name she never gave it herself, but one history did, because the world she'd built refused to forget her. But just beyond all that golden light, ships were gathering. An old queen would soon face her greatest test, standing before her soldiers, armored not in silk but steel. And the people who once doubted her would see what kind of ruler fear had made her. Tonight, the Queen of England walks slowly through her palace, torches flickering on the walls, footsteps echoing on stone. Her crown feels heavier than ever, but she holds her head high. Because if she learned anything in all those years of watching, waiting, and surviving, it's that fear, when you control it, is just another kind of power. The sea outside is restless. The summer of 1588 began with omens, strange comets, sudden storms, and priests muttering that heaven itself was sharpening its swords. Spain, richest empire on earth, had finally lost patience. King Philip II, widower of Elizabeth's half-sister Mary, decided to do what no one else had managed: invade England, kill the heretic queen, and restore the old faith. The plan was called the Enterprise of England, which sounds like a ship name but was really just one giant revenge tour. Philip gathered over 130 ships, some massive enough to carry small towns, packed them with soldiers, priests, and cannons, and pointed them toward the English Channel. The Spanish Armada, a floating city of war, was coming. News spread fast across England. Church bells rang, soldiers were summoned, blacksmiths hammered day and night. And in the middle of all that noise, people waited for their queen. Elizabeth could have hidden in one of her castles. She could have let her generals handle it, but she didn't. Instead, she rode out in person to Tilbury, where her troops were camped, waiting to defend against invasion. Imagine it. Dust rising, banners snapping in the wind, and in the middle of the army, a 54-year-old queen wearing a white gown under silver armor. No crown, no throne, just steel, courage, and a presence so steady the men forgot she was, technically, supposed to be fragile. She rode a grey horse, her voice clear and calm. The soldiers fell silent as she began to speak, and though her speech has been rewritten and romanticized over the years, the heart of it remains. I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. That line alone could have fed an empire. The troops erupted. Even those who doubted her before were shouting her name now, and while Elizabeth inspired from the shore, her navy prepared to meet the Armada head-on. England's ships were smaller, faster, and far more annoying, like a swarm of hornets against a lumbering giant. Commanded by men like Sir Francis Drake, they used speed and clever tactics to break the Spanish formation. When the Armada anchored off Calais, planning to pick up more troops, the English sent fireships, old vessels set ablaze and sent drifting straight into the enemy line. In the panic, Spain's great fleets scattered. Then came wind, rain, and chaos. The Protestant wind, as the English later called it, tearing sails, smashing hulls, sending mighty ships crashing into northern rocks. By the end, the proud Armada was broken. Out of more than 130 ships, barely half limped home. England had survived. Elizabeth, of course, turned that victory into legend. She had medals struck, portraits painted, poets commissioned. In one famous image, she stands triumphant, hand on a globe, her feet over the map of Europe, the sun breaking through clouds behind her. Every detail whispered the same thing. She was chosen. She was eternal. But behind the art and celebration, the win wasn't as simple as it looked. The Armada's destruction was due as much to luck and weather as strategy. But luck favors the prepared, and Elizabeth had prepared better than anyone expected. For a brief, shining moment, she was the embodiment of her nation's pride. England, once a small, doubtful island, now stood tall against the mightiest power in the world. After that, no one dared call her weak again. She ruled for another 15 years, her legend growing with every decade. Poets called her Gloriana, explorers dedicated their discoveries to her name. Courtiers compared her to goddesses so often that she half believed it. And yet, power always comes at a cost. In the glow of victory, Elizabeth's private world began to shrink. Her court grew younger while she grew older. Her favorites, men like Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, brought fire and danger back into her life. He was handsome, reckless, and convinced he could charm his way through politics. For a while, he did. He called her my sweet mistress, even kissed her hand in public. But Elizabeth was no one's fool. When Essex bungled a campaign in Ireland and tried to stage a revolt in London, Elizabeth didn't hesitate. The same queen who had once wept for Mary, Queen of Scots, now signed Essex's death warrant without flinching. He was executed in 1601. Those close to her said that afterward, something in her went quiet. She became restless at night, pacing her chambers, refusing to sleep. Her courtiers still showered her with compliments, but she saw the pity behind their smiles. Her mirrors were covered now, too many reminders of time. The same woman who'd faced down kings and armadas couldn't face her own reflection. In her final years, she spoke less and listened more, sitting by the fire as musicians played soft tunes from her youth. Sometimes she'd murmur a few words, half to herself, half to the ghosts she'd outlived. When she finally died in 1603, she left no heir. But she left something far greater, a legacy carved in iron and flame. The Elizabethan age would become a symbol of power, wit, and pride. And though history would argue about her ruthlessness, her vanity, her brilliance, one thing never changed. No ruler had ever made England feel so alive, so untouchable, so feared. So tonight, as you drift off, picture her not as the untouchable Virgin Queen, but as a woman alone at her window, the moonlight touching her red hair, the same fire still in her eyes. A queen who learned that fear, used wisely, could build an empire. Sleep easy, traveler. England is safe, the winds are calm, and the Queen still watches from her tower. The last years of Elizabeth's life felt like the long hush after a storm. England was richer, louder, more confident than ever. London swelled with traders, theatres, and taverns. Children who'd been born after the Armada couldn't even imagine a time when their queen wasn't there, like the sun, always shining, always certain. But in the high, draughty halls of her palaces, Elizabeth moved slower now. She still dressed with care, white powder, jewels, layers of gold-threaded fabric, but beneath all that splendor, her body trembled with age. The paint on her face hid not vanity, but fear, fear of being forgotten, of losing control, of time itself turning traitor. Her courtiers whispered that she had become lonely. It wasn't unkind gossip, more like pity. She'd never married, never had children, and most of those she'd once trusted were dead. Robert Dudley, her lifelong companion, was gone. His last letter, folded and faded, still lay in a box beside her bed, the one she opened on sleepless nights. Sometimes she'd walk the palace gardens at dusk, wrapped in a cloak heavy with pearls. Servants watched from a distance, pretending not to see her pause by the statues, her lips moving in quiet conversation with ghosts. She'd murmur things like, "We were not meant for peace," or "I did what I must." It was true, she had done what she must. Elizabeth had ruled through betrayal, war, and fire, holding her throne when everyone thought she'd lose it. But there's a strange emptiness that comes with winning everything. You look around and realize you've outlived everyone you fought for. Her nights were restless now. The court musicians would play soft tunes outside her chamber, the same ballads that had once made her smile. Sometimes she'd ask them to stop mid-song. The silence felt more honest. She sat by the fire, eyes half closed, remembering the sound of laughter echoing through younger halls, Mary's soft voice, her father's booming steps, Dudley's teasing grin, all of them gone, leaving her alone with the crown that had once felt like salvation, and now felt more like a weight. And yet, even in her weariness, she refused to give up control. She kept ruling, signing papers, settling disputes, demanding reports. Every morning, her attendants dressed her as if she were about to meet an army. They would lay out layer after layer, the ruffs, the jeweled collars, the crimson gowns, until she stood there, tall and blazing, more symbol than woman. Because that was the secret. Elizabeth knew that power was theater. She had spent her life performing strength until strength became her truth. Even as her body weakened, her voice never did. When her advisers gently suggested she rest more, she replied, "The word must be mine, for the world hath long known no other." There was something both fierce and tragic about it, like a candle refusing to flicker out, even as the wax burned low. In those last months, she refused food more often, refused her bed entirely. She would sit on cushions on the floor, silent for hours, lost in thought. Those who saw her said it was as if she were already half in another world, remembering everything she'd survived, and everything she'd lost. When her council begged her to name a successor, she only smiled faintly. She already knew who it would be, James VI of Scotland, the son of her cousin Mary, the same woman she'd executed years ago. History, it seems, always finds a way to loop back on itself. And then one evening, in March 1603, The queen, who had once terrified half of Europe, finally closed her eyes for good. No armies, no thunder, no speeches, just silence. A long exhale after 44 years of rule. They say her death chamber was still lit with candles long after she was gone, her ladies weeping softly as they dressed her one last time. Pearls, lace, and the faint scent of rosewater. When they carried her through London, the people lined the streets in silence. Even the bells seemed to ring slower, lower, as if mourning not just a ruler, but an age. Because when Elizabeth died, something more than a person ended. An entire era went with her. The world she'd built, balanced on fear and wit and sheer willpower, dissolved into history. The poets called it the end of Gloriana. The people simply called it the end of our queen. And yet, she never really left. Her face lived on in paintings, her words in letters, her legend in every story England ever told itself afterward. She became less of a woman, more of a symbol. The queen who ruled alone, loved her country fiercely, and refused to bend to anyone's command. When you think of her now, don't just picture the powdered mask or the gold gown. Picture the girl she once was, small, frightened, watching her mother's fate, learning early that survival meant silence. Then picture her older self, standing before her army, hands steady, eyes bright, heart unshakable. That's the full circle of Elizabeth's power, not born of cruelty or ego, but of endurance. She became feared because she understood what fear was and used it instead of letting it use her. So as you drift towards sleep, imagine her throne empty now, the crown resting on velvet, the air in the chamber still. Outside, dawn creeps over the Thames. London wakes again, just as it always has. But somewhere, in that soft grey light, the spirit of the Queen still walks the halls, calm, proud, eternal. The Virgin Queen, the survivor, the woman who turned fear into history. Sleep well, traveller. Tomorrow we'll find another story, but tonight, England rests under her watchful eyes. The day Elizabeth died, the kingdom held its breath. Not just because a ruler had fallen, but because no one could remember life without her. 44 years on the throne, that's almost 2 generations of people who'd never known another monarch. To them, Elizabeth wasn't a person anymore. She was England itself. In the first few days after her death, London moved strangely slow. Markets opened, ships sailed, people went to work, but it was all quieter, softer, like a city afraid to speak too loudly. The bells tolled from every church tower, echoing down narrow streets, slick with early spring rain. And in the candlelit rooms of noble houses, men and women whispered about what would come next. Would there be chaos, war, a fight for the throne? Everyone remembered the blood-soaked decades before her, the beheadings, the religious wars, the fear that hung like smoke. No one wanted to go back to that. But to their surprise, peace held. Elizabeth's chosen successor, James VI of Scotland, the son of her old rival Mary, was declared James I of England without a drop of blood spilled. He rode south to London to take his crown, and though the streets were crowded with cheering faces, he knew he'd stepped into a shadow far bigger than his own name. Because even dead, Elizabeth ruled the room. Her image was everywhere, painted, printed, remembered. Every noble's wall held a version of her, the calm gaze, the pale skin, the red gold hair arranged like flames. Poets still called her Gloriana. Playwrights like Shakespeare still filled their lines with echoes of her world. Queens who ruled with wit instead of swords, women who held power through sheer brilliance. Even the sailors, those rough men who'd fought under her flag during the Armada, still toasted her name in smoky taverns along the Thames. They'd raise mugs and mutter, "God save the Queen," out of habit, then catch themselves, laugh softly, and say, "Well, she already did." History likes to move on quickly after a monarch dies, but Elizabeth didn't allow that. Her legacy clung to everything. The age that bore her name, the Elizabethan age, became a symbol of golden light, of exploration, theatre, poetry, and victory. Of course, not everything was golden. There was poverty, plague, harsh laws, and cruel punishments. But people remembered what they wanted to, and what they wanted was a queen who'd made them believe in greatness. In truth, she had been a paradox. A woman who ruled like a man, but refused to stop being a woman. A monarch who never married, yet spent her life surrounded by men who adored her. A leader who built her image on chastity, but weaponized flirtation like a diplomat's pen. She had turned survival into performance art, and centuries later, were still watching. Some of her letters survived, fragile pieces of paper covered in slanted handwriting, sealed with red wax. In them, she was fierce, witty, even funny. In one, she told a foreign ambassador who'd tried to lecture her, "Though I be a woman, yet I think I must command men." Simple words. But when you remember that she wrote them in an age when women weren't supposed to rule anyone, they hit harder. Elizabeth didn't just wear the crown, she redefined what it meant. Even now, scholars still argue about her. Was she ruthless, manipulative, a master of propaganda? Yes. Was she brilliant, compassionate in her own way, deeply human? Also, yes, she was contradictions wrapped in lace, both iron and silk, and that's what made her feared. Because fear doesn't always come from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from unpredictability, from the sense that the person standing across from you is playing a different game entirely, one you can't see, but can feel. Elizabeth had that aura. Whether she was smiling, teasing, or silent, no one ever quite knew what she was thinking. That mystery was her armor. In portraits, her eyes always look slightly away, never directly at you, as if she's already thinking 3 moves ahead, as if she knows something you don't, and maybe she did, because long before modern politics, spin doctors, or image consultants, she understood the power of illusion. She knew that a ruler doesn't have to be loved, only believed, and she made England believe. When you look at her story as a whole, it almost feels like a play. Act 1, the frightened girl in danger. Act 2, the cautious queen holding power by her fingertips. Act 3, the fearless monarch defying empires. And the final act, the quiet ending, the lonely room, the candle burning down. But even in that ending, there's a kind of peace, because she did what she set out to do. She survived, ruled, and left behind a legend too large to die. The poets were right. She became Gloriana, a spirit more than a woman, a name that meant victory, wit, and endurance. And maybe that's why, even now, when people speak of Great Britain, the image that flickers in the mind, red hair, pale skin, fierce eyes, isn't a king's, it's hers. So, as the centuries roll by and the candles of her time fade into history's mist, Elizabeth still watches, not from a throne, but from memory itself. The queen who made fear elegant and power eternal. Now, the palace is quiet again. The storm has passed, the sea is calm, and her crown rests where no one dares disturb it. The echoes of her laughter and command fade into the stillness of night. Close your eyes now. We've walked through her world, through fire and silk, through fear and glory. The story of Elizabeth I isn't about perfection, it's about survival. And sometimes, that's the most powerful thing a human or a queen can do. When a ruler dies, the crown doesn't just pass to another head, it passes through history, carrying everything they stood for. For Elizabeth, that crown carried the weight of transformation. Before her, England had been small, divided, cautious. After her, it began to dream, to build ships that could touch the edges of the world, to write plays that still fill theaters for centuries later, to imagine itself as something more than an island, as a destiny. That was Elizabeth's real victory. She didn't just rule, she shaped imagination itself. In the years after her death, the English people turned her life into legend. Painters couldn't resist her face, not because they had new portraits to work from, but because she had become an idea. She wasn't just Elizabeth Tudor anymore. She was the Virgin Queen, Gloriana Estrella, the earthly goddess of peace and empire. They painted her surrounded by stars, holding globes, crowned by angels. Reality melted into myth, and she became part of the story England told about itself. The irony, of course, was that this goddess had spent her life painfully human. She'd laughed too loud, loved too deeply, and aged too slowly for her own comfort. But that's how history works. It polishes until the cracks disappear. And sometimes, those cracks are where the truth lives. In the early 1600s, new voices started to echo in her absence. The poets and playwrights she had once protected kept her spirit alive in their words. Shakespeare wrote of queens who wielded power through grace and wit, reflections of her in disguise. When Twelfth Night or The Merchant of Venice played in the Globe, the audience could feel Elizabeth's presence between lines, the clever woman who'd taught the world that intelligence could be royal. Even her enemies couldn't quite escape her. Spain, which had once sent the Armada against her, eventually spoke of her with reluctant admiration. Ambassadors who'd once called her the heretic queen began to call her wise beyond measure, and so the myth grew. Each decade added another layer: the fearless commander, the golden goddess, the mother of her nation. The uncomfortable parts, the executions, the imprisonments, the loneliness, were carefully set aside. History, like Elizabeth herself, knew the power of performance. But behind all that myth-making, her influence quietly persisted in more practical ways too. Under her reign, the English Navy had been born, the same navy that would later carry explorers, colonists, and merchants across the oceans. The seeds of the British Empire were planted in her lifetime, watered by courage and a hint of arrogance. Centuries later, people would look back and say, it all began with her. She would have loved that, of course. A queen who built her image as eternal wouldn't mind being called the mother of an empire. And yet, it's interesting to think, Elizabeth never saw the empire, never saw India under British rule, or the ships sailing toward Australia, or the colonies forming in America. Her world was smaller, more fragile, and somehow more real. Her England was still a place of muddy streets, candlelight, and cold stone castles. And yet, she ruled it with such vision that people centuries later still felt as if she were in the room. Even now, when historians debate her, her faith, her politics, her motives, there's a kind of awe underneath it. Because whatever she did alone. No husband, no heir. Just one woman, steering a country through a world of kings. That's why she remains both feared and admired. She mastered the art of standing alone. The people who came after her, James, Charles, the rest, all ruled in her shadow. They had armies, parliaments, crowns, and yet they lacked something. That spark, that balance of charm and steel that made people obey without knowing why. Elizabeth had it. No one quite did again. Over time, even her enemies softened into nostalgia. The Catholics who'd once cursed her name found her portrait strangely comforting. Revolutionaries invoked her as a symbol of freedom. Feminists called her the first modern woman. Everyone, in their own way, claimed her. That's the strange afterlife of power. Once you're gone, people mold you into whatever they need. Elizabeth became a mirror, reflecting every dream England ever had about itself. And maybe that's fitting, because throughout her life, she'd been a master of mirrors, of crafting the image people wanted to see, while hiding what she truly felt. She would have understood perfectly. So, in a sense, she never died. She just changed forms from flesh to symbol, from ruler to myth. Every time a girl reads about her and smiles at her defiance, every time a stage actress dons red hair and lace, every time someone whispers the Virgin Queen, she flickers back into life. It's strange, isn't it, how fear can outlast even the body. Elizabeth had once said, I do not desire to live or reign longer than my life, and reign shall be for your good. But her reign didn't end. It simply stretched, quietly, across time. So tonight, as the fog rolls over the Thames and the echoes of bells fade, imagine that shadow still standing on the palace balcony, a pale figure against the dark sky, crown catching the moonlight, eyes sharp with that same old question, who will dare to rule like me? And the answer, whispered softly through history, is no one yet. Elizabeth was many things: clever, charming, terrifying when she needed to be, but above all, she was strategic. She understood something that most kings never did. Fear, if used wisely, could be safer than love. Not the wild, chaotic kind of fear that turns into rebellion. The subtler kind, the kind that makes people respect boundaries, that makes ambassadors think twice before lying. Nobles think twice before plotting, and rivals think twice before sending armies. She didn't need to shout or kill to inspire it. Her power was quieter, colder, the kind that made people nervous in her presence, even when she smiled. Foreign diplomats often wrote about it in letters home. One Spanish envoy described how the Queen's eyes alone command obedience. Another said, when she is displeased, no man dares draw breath until she is soothed. Imagine that, a court full of hardened politicians, warriors, and aristocrats, holding their breath because one woman raised an eyebrow. That was the kind of fear Elizabeth wielded, elegant, contained, almost artistic. She'd learned early on that to survive, she had to control not just her image, but the emotions of everyone around her, and she had a lifetime of practice. When she was a child, her mother was executed for treason. When she was a teenager, her father's moods could decide whether she lived or died. And when her half-sister Mary ruled, Elizabeth spent months imprisoned in the Tower, accused of conspiracy. She stared at her own death so often that she became fluent in the language of fear, both how to feel it and how to make others feel it. By the time she became queen, she'd turned that language into policy. Take religion, for example. England in 1558 was a mess of faiths: Catholics, Protestants, Reformers, Radicals, everyone trying to claim God for themselves. Mary's reign had ended in blood, with heretics burning in the streets. Elizabeth couldn't afford that chaos again, so she didn't pick a side. She invented her own. The Elizabethan religious settlement was her masterpiece, vague enough to please both sides, firm enough to stop fighting. To Catholics, she was not as bad as Mary's enemies. To Protestants, she was not as fanatical as Mary. To everyone else, she was the one person holding the whole kingdom together by sheer willpower, and she enforced it with a smile that said, "You don't want to test me." Anyone who did like the Catholic plotters supporting Mary, Queen of Scots, quickly discovered that beneath that calm exterior was a woman who could sign an execution warrant without blinking. But she never killed for pleasure. Every execution, every exile, was a performance, a message. She wanted the world to know, "I am merciful, but do not mistake mercy for weakness." Then there was her court, a dizzying world of poets, spies, and schemers, half theatre, half chessboard. Elizabeth kept everyone slightly off balance. She flirted with courtiers, praised them, mocked them, rewarded them, and then replaced them without warning. One day you were the son of her affection, the next you were in disgrace. It wasn't cruelty, it was control. She knew the moment anyone felt secure, they'd start dreaming of her throne. So she made security impossible. Even her closest advisor, William Cecil, sometimes left her chamber pale and trembling, unsure if he'd pleased or angered her. And yet he always returned because he feared her, yes, but also trusted her to be the smartest person in the room. That balance of affection and authority was her true genius. She never ruled through terror. She ruled through tension. Every relationship was a thread she could pull. She had this saying, "I will have but one mistress, and no master," and she meant it. It applied to her kingdom, her ministers, even her own heart. Which brings us to her most famous piece of political theatre, her supposed virginity. Historians have argued endlessly about whether it was real, symbolic, or just convenient branding. But in practice, it was brilliant politics. By refusing to marry, she kept foreign kings guessing and her nobles divided. Spain wanted her to wed a Catholic prince. France sent flattering envoys and romantic letters. Even her own courtiers, men like Robert Dudley, hoped to win her hand. And she let them all believe they might. It was like watching a master card player who never reveals what S in her hand, only that you should be very careful betting against her. Her unmarried status also gave her a strange kind of freedom. She wasn't a wife or a widow or a pawn. She was a ruler who answered to no one. People called her the Virgin Queen, thinking it meant purity, but it really meant sovereignty. No king, no pope, no husband could claim authority over her. Her body became a symbol of independence, her most powerful weapon in a world that wanted to cage women in alliances and marriages. That's how she used fear again, not through punishment, but through unpredictability. She made herself impossible to read, impossible to manipulate. Everyone feared making the wrong move, and so they hesitated, and while they hesitated, she ruled. There's something hypnotic about that, isn't there? How she turned every social expectation, marriage, faith, beauty, obedience, into armor. Most queens were defined by their husbands. Elizabeth defined herself by the absence of one. Most monarchs demanded loyalty. She inspired it by keeping people just nervous enough to crave her approval. She once told Parliament, "I am already bound unto an husband, which is the kingdom of England," and she meant it fiercely. That marriage to her country, as strange as it sounds, was one of devotion and fear both. She loved her people, but never too much. She trusted her counselors, but never completely. She relied on her spies more than her friends, and that's what made her formidable. Fear wasn't her weakness, it was her compass. She understood it, navigated it, and used it to steer an entire nation toward stability. When people call her England's most feared ruler, they often picture the executions or the Armada. But her real power came from subtler things: a look, a pause, a decision to stay silent when others demanded words. She ruled through stillness, through mystery. through the knowledge that no one ever truly knew what she'd do next. And as the night deepens, it's almost comforting to think of that, a candlelit queen sitting alone, eyes sharp, mind racing, surrounded by advisors who fear her brilliance as much as they admire it. Not the fire of terror, the quiet, steady burn of respect. That's the kind of fear that lasts. If fear was Elizabeth's invisible crown, then her spies were the jewels that made it glitter. Long before modern intelligence agencies existed, before anyone had even coined the term Secret Service, she was quietly building one of her own. It started small, whispers, letters, suspicious glances at court. But under her reign, espionage became an art. England in the 1560s was a nest of plots, Catholic nobles scheming to replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots, Spanish agents sneaking messages through ambassadors, preachers and merchants acting as messengers for rebellion. And Elizabeth knew that survival meant knowing everything before it happened. So she turned to a man named Sir Francis Walsingham, a serious sharp-eyed Puritan with nerves of iron and an obsession with loyalty. If Elizabeth was the brain of the kingdom, Walsingham became its nervous system. He set up a network that stretched from London taverns to Italian courts, from Paris to Prague. Spies disguised as merchants, diplomats, even actors carried coded letters, invisible ink, and false names. Every week, messages arrived at his desk, some true, some false, all dangerous. Walsingham read them all, then passed only the ones that mattered to the Queen. And she read them too, not as a distant ruler, but as someone who understood the game personally. She'd been a prisoner once. She knew what it felt like to be watched. Now, she was the watcher. The walls of her court had ears. No secret was safe for long. A lady-in-waiting might whisper to her lover, and by morning, Elizabeth knew what was said. An ambassador might try to pass a coded message, and by nightfall, Walsingham's men had already intercepted and decoded it. Sometimes, Elizabeth would even drop hints in conversation, just enough to let people know she knew. Imagine being a courtier, sitting in her presence, realizing she had just casually mentioned something you'd said in private 3 days earlier. You'd smile and nod, but your stomach would twist. That's power. That's fear, finely tuned to perfection. The most famous of all her spy victories came with the downfall of Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary had been a problem for decades, a rival queen with a better claim to the English throne in the eyes of Catholics, and a magnet for conspiracies. Elizabeth had kept her imprisoned for years, trying to avoid open execution, but Mary wouldn't stop plotting. And that's when Walsingham set the trap. Through careful forgery and surveillance, he let a fake safe communication channel reach Mary. Letters were hidden in beer barrels, written in code. Mary thought she was safely sending messages to her supporters, but every single one went through Walsingham's hands first. And then came the fateful letter, the one where Mary approved Elizabeth's assassination. It was all Walsingham needed. The evidence went straight to the Queen. Elizabeth hesitated. She always did when it came to killing a fellow monarch, but in the end, fear won. Mary was executed at Fothering Castle in 1587. It wasn't just a death. It was a message to the world. No one plots against Elizabeth and lives. The ripple of that execution traveled across Europe. Kings and popes called her a monster. Commoners whispered she was unstoppable, and maybe she was. Even her enemies began to believe she had supernatural intuition, that she simply knew things before they happened. But behind that aura was Walsingham's invisible army, cracking codes, intercepting letters, following trails of ink and rumor. They even used tricks centuries ahead of their time. Cipher disks for encrypted writing in visible ink, made from alum and gall. False seals that could be lifted and replaced without breaking. Every bit of knowledge came to Elizabeth's desk, and she read it all. She once joked that the only thing she feared was being bored, but her eyes flicked faster than anyone's, scanning for danger in every word. And she used that information strategically. When she learned of a plot, she didn't always crush it immediately. Sometimes, she'd let it grow to see who else was involved. A patient hunter, not a panicked ruler. She knew that to rule by fear, you couldn't show fear yourself. So she smiled. She hosted banquets. She played music while her enemies slowly walked into their own traps. That was Elizabeth's brilliance. She could make control look like calm, and the English people loved her for it. They called her clever, divine, even magical. But deep down, they were a little afraid too. Because if she could see everything, what else might she know? This atmosphere of controlled unease kept England remarkably stable. No great uprisings, no civil wars, just the quiet hum of a nation held together by secrets and discipline. Even when the Spanish Armada came thundering across the sea, Elizabeth's spies had already warned her months in advance. By the time Spain's ships reached the Channel, England was ready, ships armed, troops trained, wind prayed for. It's strange to think how much of that famous victory was built, not on cannons, but on letters. The War of Ink had been won before the War of Fire began. After the Armada, Elizabeth's reputation as a ruler who knew all things became legendary. She didn't just defeat the mightiest empire of the age, she did it as a woman who had outthought every man who underestimated her. From that moment on, she was no longer just a monarch, she was untouchable. Foreign rulers sent ambassadors dripping with compliments and gifts, but under the flattery, there was fear. Because they all understood what the Spanish king had learned the hard way. You could fight Elizabeth with ships and armies, but she'd already fought you with whispers and shadows. That's what made her reign so enduring. It wasn't luck. It wasn't even divine favor. It was information. And information, handled by a woman who'd learned to trust no one but herself, became the sharpest weapon in England's history. Even now, historians look back and call her the founder of British intelligence. But maybe it's simpler than that. Elizabeth didn't invent spying, she just perfected listening, and she did it with that same calm smile, the one that made her court wonder, every time she looked at them, what she already knew. So tonight, imagine her again, alone in her chamber, letters spread before her like tarot cards, a single candle glowing beside her. The queen who saw the world through ink and silence, the woman who turned secrets into power. And somewhere, in the stillness of that room, a whisper rises. Not from ghosts or servants, but from history itself. Never underestimate the quiet ones. When fear has done its work, when the nobles behave, the spies report, and the rivals are gone, something remarkable happens. The air clears, people stop fighting long enough to imagine things, and out of that uneasy peace came the glittering skin of the Elizabethan Golden Age. It's strange, isn't it? The same queen who ruled through tension also created the calm that let art breathe. Painters, poets, and sailors all moved under her steady gaze. Everyone wanted to impress the woman who could freeze them with one look. Her court became a stage, music in the galleries, dancing in the halls, verses whispered in corners. Flattery was the currency, and imagination was the safest way to spend it. You couldn't out-argue Elizabeth, but you could charm her with beauty. So, people tried. And in doing so, they accidentally built one of the richest cultures England had ever seen. The Queen and the stage enter William Shakespeare. He never wrote a play for Elizabeth directly, at least, not officially, but her presence haunted his theatre. Strong queens, clever women in disguise, witty heroines who outtalk men twice their size. Sound familiar? When Twelfth Night's Viola tricks a duke, or Much Ado's Beatrice bends language like steel, you can almost feel Elizabeth smirking somewhere behind the curtain. Even A Midsummer Night's Dream, with its magical queen Titania, reflects the same fascination, ruler of a realm, surrounded by fools, untouchable and oddly lonely. The theatres themselves blossomed under her loose protection. Puritans hated them, nobles sneered at them, but Elizabeth tolerated the noise. She saw what they didn't. That laughter kept the peace. As long as people could mock kings safely on stage, they might not try to dethrone one in real life. And besides, she loved a good performance. Once, after a comedy at court, she teased the actors, saying, "You make the world merry, and me forget my years." Imagine that, a tired queen, lines on her face, letting herself laugh for a night while the audience pretended the world was simple again. Painters of a fearful goddess while playwrights toyed with words. Painters worked with illusion. Every portrait of Elizabeth was a riddle. There's one where she's standing on a map of the world, hand resting on a Globe de Armada portrait. Behind her, the defeated Spanish ships burn. In her hair, pearls for purity. On her gown, suns and stars. No wrinkles, no fatigue, no age, though she was over 50 when it was painted. She demanded to be painted not as she was, but as she meant to be remembered. The artists obeyed. They learned to mix devotion with fear. Too plain, and you risked displeasure. Too flattering, and people would whisper that you mocked her. So they painted symbols instead of faces, eyes on sleeves, vigilance. Serpents on skirts, wisdom. A hand on the globe, dominion. Her body became a language of empire. Sailors, maps, and the edge of the world. Fear has another side. It drives people outward. Under Elizabeth, men who might have fought at home instead sailed into the unknown. She didn't have the money for vast armies, but she did have courage to lend. So she gave out licenses, legal piracy, relied to explorers like Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh. They raided Spanish ships, returned with gold, spices, and stories, and dedicated it all to their queen. Drake circled the globe and came back alive. Raleigh sent men to the Americas and named a whole region Virginia after Elizabeth herself. The irony that the Virgin Queen lent her name to lands soon filled with very unvirgin colonies would have made her laugh. She knighted them publicly, turning thieves into heroes. It was propaganda at its best. Every English victory, every exotic tale, became proof that God favored Elizabeth. Behind the romance of it, of course, lay greed and violent ships looting, sailors dying of scurvy, captains arguing over treasure. But back home, it all sounded like destiny. The Queen's calm hand had guided England to greatness. A kingdom of masks, Elizabeth's court lived on ceremony. Every movement meant something. A bow to deep showed desperation, a glance to long suggested ambition. Even her meals were performances. She dined in public, sitting under a canopy, while nobles watched her eat because to see the Queen was to remember who ruled. Yet, beneath that glitter, people whispered. They wondered how she endured. 40 years of control, 40 years of balancing affection and fear. No husband, no children, no privacy, only the endless choreography of power. And still she danced. Sometimes, during festivals, she'd surprise everyone by joining in the music. She once told a courtier who apologized for his clumsy dancing, "If your feet be heavy, then make your heart light, and it will lead them." That was Elizabeth in a sentence, commanding and kind in the same breath, never fully one or the other. Legacy in motion. By the late 1580s and 1590s, her world was shifting. The young poets she'd inspired were aging. Walsingham had died. Her favorite courtiers were gone or married. But her cultural machine kept spinning. Books poured from London presses. Maps grew more detailed. The English language itself was expanding. New words, new rhythms. A nation that had once been unsure of its identity was now brimming with it. That identity, curious, daring, a little arrogant, was hers. She had stamped her temperament onto an entire generation. Even people who feared her carried her influence in their pens and their sails. And when you picture her now, you can almost see the contradiction that made it all possible. A woman both terrifying and adored, ruling through restraint, yet inspiring art that overflowed with emotion. That's why the Elizabethan age glows even now. It wasn't just about peace or prosperity. It was about imagination unleashed under watchful eyes. Fear kept the walls standing, but within those walls, the world bloomed. So, as the night deepens and the fire settles into ash, imagine her walking the palace halls, one last time passing portraits that show her as a goddess, hearing a play being rehearsed in a courtyard, catching a faint echo of a sailor's song drifting through the window. A queen surrounded by the creations her control had made possible. The ruler who taught England to dream carefully, beautifully, under supervision. Time, like politics, is something even a queen can't negotiate with. And by the 1590s, Elizabeth was running out of both. The same courtiers who once bowed eagerly now watched her with a kind of nervous tenderness. Her face, once painted to perfection, began to show the lines of sleepless nights. Her fiery hair grew thin beneath the wigs. Her hands trembled slightly when she signed her name. But if she felt age, she refused to admit it. She had spent her whole life playing the role of the eternal queen, strong, ageless, untouchable. And she wasn't about to break character now, so she doubled down. More jewels, more ceremony, more makeup, more speeches that reminded everyone she was still, in her own words, married to my kingdom. Behind closed doors, though, the story was different. The woman who had once kept all England on its toes now found herself increasingly isolated. Her old allies were dying one by one. Her council meetings felt quieter, and without realizing it, she had built a world so centered on her control that no one dared get close enough to comfort her. It's one of the cruel ironies of power. The same fear that keeps you safe from enemies also keeps you distant from friends. Elizabeth had learned that lesson too well. Her last favorite, the young and dashing Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, seemed like a spark of youth returned to court. He was brave, charming, and dangerously confident. For a while, she adored him the way she had once adored his stepfather, Robert Dudley, decades before. But Essex wasn't like Dudley. He was restless, proud, and reckless. He wanted glory, not patience. When she sent him to Ireland to suppress rebellion, he disobeyed orders, made peace instead of victory, and then most unforgivably returned to England without permission. He burst into her chambers unannounced, muddy and unshaven, as if she was still the young queen who'd tolerate impulsive charm. But she wasn't. She was 70, and she'd had a lifetime of being underestimated. Her fury was volcanic. In that moment, the Virgin Queen, the mother of the nation, became the woman who had survived prisons and plots and kings. She slapped him, screamed that he had broken her trust, and ordered him away. It could have ended there, just a bad memory between ruler and subject. But Essex didn't learn. He gathered followers, plotted rebellion, and marched into London claiming he only wanted to free the Queen from bad counsel. It was treason, plain and simple. And Elizabeth, tired, aging, heartsick, signed his death warrant. They say she hesitated before doing it, that she paced her rooms for hours. Some even claim she prayed that someone else would stop her. But in the end, she did what she had always done, what was necessary. Essex was executed in 1601. When the news reached her, she locked herself in her chambers for days. No food, no visitors, no words. The Queen, who had once ruled through fear, was now trapped in her own fear of loneliness, fear of regret, fear that she had become exactly what her enemies once said she'd be: cold, unfeeling, tyrannical. From that point on, the court changed. The laughter quieted, the masks slipped. Everyone could feel the end approaching, even if no one dared say it. Elizabeth stopped holding long audiences. She avoided mirrors. The once endless banquets grew shorter, quieter. Even her beloved music, which had once filled the palace halls, now made her weep. The woman who had been England's sun was dimming, and the whole realm felt colder for it. In the last months of her life, something strange began to happen. She stopped sleeping. She refused her bed entirely, saying she would not lie down to die. Instead, she stood or sat on cushions for hours, wrapped in robes, staring at the floor. Her courtiers begged her to rest, to eat, to name a successor. She would only whisper, "I will have no successor." It wasn't stubbornness, it was sorrow. For 45 years, England had been her. Every law, every ship, every prayer began and ended with her name. To imagine someone else wearing the crown was to imagine the end of her own existence. And maybe, in that quiet, sleepless vigil, she realized what all powerful people eventually do, that the world moves on. Even when you've ruled it with perfection. Those who saw her at the end said her face had turned almost translucent, the last traces of rouge gone. Yet her eyes remained sharp, as if she could still see through walls, through lies, through time itself. One witness said, Her Majesty's mind was bright as ever, though her body failed. Another said, she seemed half in this world, half in the next. On the night of March 24, 1603, as the candles burned low in Richmond Palace, Elizabeth finally let herself rest. No grand speeches, no last words, recorded just silence. The same silence that had always been her greatest weapon. She was 70 years old. She had ruled England for 44 of them. When her body was discovered the next morning, they said her face looked peaceful, and on her finger was a ring of ruby, shaped like a heart, worn thin from years of use. The people mourned as if the sun itself had gone out. Church bells tolled for hours. Streets filled with weeping. Even her enemies felt a strange emptiness, because whether they'd loved her or feared her, they'd all been living in her shadow. The legend had ended, but the myth was just beginning. And perhaps that was her truest fear, all along, not death, but being forgotten. She needn't have worried. The Elizabeth who died that night was human, frail, exhausted, lonely. But the Elizabeth who lived on was something else entirely. An icon, a symbol, a ghost that would haunt English history for centuries. She had ruled a kingdom through charm, calculation, and silence. She had survived betrayal, invasion, and heartbreak. She had made fear elegant. And in doing so, she had done what few monarchs ever could. She had become unforgettable. So as you drift toward sleep, imagine that quiet chamber again, the flickering candle, the red stone ring, the slow, even breath of the woman who once commanded the world. Her reign is over, but her story never ends. Because somewhere, in the hush between history and dream, she still watches, still rules, still waits. The Queen may have died, but her story was far from finished. In England, legends don't die, they simply change costume. And Elizabeth, even in death, was a master of costume changes. When her successor, James VI of Scotland, rode south to take the English throne, he stepped into a country wrapped in mourning and myth. He was the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, the woman Elizabeth had executed. That alone made his inheritance feel complicated, like moving into a house still haunted by its former owner. Everywhere he went, people still whispered Elizabeth's name. Her portraits hung in city halls and taverns. Her image gleamed on coins. And though James called himself a peacemaker, many still measured him against her. She had been fire and thunder. He was bookish and cautious. Some said England missed being ruled by fear. Others said England finally felt safe. But either way, Elizabeth's presence was impossible to ignore. It's strange, isn't it, how fear can outlive the one who caused it. In the decades that followed, Elizabeth was turned into something almost divine. Painters made her younger, fairer, taller. Poets called her Gloriana Astrea, the fairy queen. They compared her to goddesses and saints, as if her temper, her suspicions, her vanity had never existed. Her reign became a golden age in memory, even if it had been iron and blood in reality. That's the thing about memory, it edits. And Elizabeth had given England so many dazzling things to remember. Shakespeare's plays, Drake's voyages, the defeat of the Armada, the birth of empire. In life, she had been feared. In death, she became perfection. But the real Elizabeth was still there, buried under the gold leaf and legend. She was the child who had watched her mother die, the prisoner who read poetry to stay sane, the queen who ruled alone, not because she loved solitude, but because she had learned that trust was expensive. And even centuries later, historians kept trying to figure her out. Was she brilliant or paranoid, cold or compassionate? Did she rule through wisdom, more through fear disguised as grace? The answer, like most truths about powerful people, was all of the above. Over time, her legend spread beyond England. Painters in Europe recreated her in lavish gowns and pearl crowns. American writers admired her as the first modern woman in power. And filmmakers, centuries later, couldn't resist her contradictions. The virgin who flirted, the ruler who cried alone, the woman who wielded fear like a sword. Even now, when someone says the Elizabethan age, it sounds like a time of brilliance and power, but also of masks, loneliness, and long nights by candlelight. And that's her real legacy. Not just the empire she helped build, but the emotional landscape she left behind. A lesson about how fear, when refined, becomes control, and how control, when perfected, becomes isolation. If you stand in Westminster Abbey today, you can still see her tomb. She lies above her half-sister Mary I, the sister who once imprisoned her. The inscription carved in Latin reads, "Partners both in throne and grave, here we sleep together in hope of resurrection." But the irony is thick. They were never partners in life. Elizabeth had outmaneuvered and outlived her sister, and even now, her name outshines Mary's on the tomb. Visitors often leave flowers, some whisper prayers, others just stare, as if expecting her eyes to open. And if you visit late, when the abbey is nearly empty, you can almost feel that old weight in the air, that silent authority, that gaze that once froze entire courts. It's as if the walls remember, because in a way, Elizabeth never really left. Every strong queen, every female leader, every woman who has had to smile while being underestimated carries a spark of her. Every moment when silence is more powerful than shouting, that's her strategy, reborn. Every time someone chooses fear as a form of respect, that's her lesson, still echoing. And maybe that's why her story still feels strangely alive, like the flicker of a candle that refuses to die out, no matter how many times you think you've snuffed it. As centuries pass, her legend keeps shapeshifting. In one era, she's the perfect queen. In another, a tyrant in pearls. In another, a lonely woman trapped in armor made of expectation. And perhaps that's why she fascinates us, because we see in her the same contradictions we see in ourselves. Pride and pain, power and vulnerability, silence and fear. Elizabeth, I wasn't just England's most feared ruler, she was one of its most human. So as you lie here now, half dreaming, half thinking, imagine her walking through a quiet garden at dawn. The world's still asleep, her crown left behind on a bench, her hair undone. For a moment, she's not the queen, not the legend, not the myth, just Elizabeth, a woman who loved books, hated mirrors, and found peace only when the world wasn't watching. The sun rises slowly, turning her shadow gold, and though the centuries move on, the shadow stays. because history never really ends, it just whispers differently with each retelling. Centuries after Elizabeth's death, England still dreams of her. Her face, half stern, half serene, still gazes down from portraits in castles, galleries, and schoolbooks. Children learn her name before they understand her story, and her reign, the Elizabethan age, has become shorthand for all things golden: discovery, art, empire, rebirth. But the truth, it wasn't golden because it was peaceful. It was golden because it burned. The fires of ambition, danger, and reinvention lit up every corner of her world, and she, standing at the center, learned to master them. When people say the Elizabethan spirit, they usually mean courage, wit, adventure. But what they forget is that under all that glory was exhaustion. Her England was held together, not by divine blessing, but by constant balancing between rich and poor, Catholic and Protestant, peace and war. And every time the scales tipped, it was her hand that steadied them. Now, centuries later, she feels more like a story than a person, a bedtime legend almost. But that's fitting, isn't it? Because Elizabeth built herself that way. She turned her life into performance, art, every glance rehearsed, every silence choreographed. She ruled like a theater queen in a world that adored spectacle. And it worked. Her speeches, her processions, even her heartbreaks were public theater, and her people loved the show. Maybe that's what made her reign so long-lived. She didn't just rule her people, she entertained them. She gave them a narrative to believe in, that England was chosen, that their queen was sacred, that order and destiny wore a white gown and a pearl crown. The truth was far less peaceful, but far more human. There's a painting from late in her life that captures this perfectly. The Rainbow Portrait. In it, Elizabeth's hair glows red, though by then she was old and grey. Her gown is covered with eyes and ears, a symbol that she sees all, hears all. In her hand, she holds a rainbow, and above her head, the Latin words, "Non sine sol iris," no rainbow without the sun. It's a portrait of control disguised as beauty. She's saying, without saying it, "You only shine because I shine." And in a strange way, she was right. She had become England's sun. And when she set, the whole world looked different. That's the thing about fear. It can be destructive, but it can also build myths. Elizabeth learned to use it, not as a weapon, but as a mirror. She made her enemies afraid of her hand, her people proud of that fear. It's a kind of brilliance that doesn't fade easily. Even now, 400 years later, the echoes of her name still shape English imagination. You can hear her ghost in Shakespeare's Queen's Clever, proud and tragic. You can see her in every leader who hides exhaustion behind a perfect smile. And you can feel her in every historical film, every crown, every retelling that ends the same way, with a single woman, standing alone, holding her ground while the world trembles. Sometimes, history remembers kings by their wars, but it remembers Elizabeth by her presence. The tilt of her head, the chill of her silence, the calm way she turned danger into devotion. And that's why she remains England's most feared ruler, not because she shouted, but because she never had to. If you listen closely, really closely, you can almost hear her voice in the wind that sweeps over the Thames, whispering through the towers she once walked. "I am Elizabeth. I have seen the world change, and I am still here." The river doesn't argue. It simply carries the words away, as if England itself still obeys her. So now, as you're lying here, eyes heavy, imagine that world again. The wooden floors of Whitehall creak softly. Somewhere, a lute plays in another room. The air smells of beeswax and ink. And in a high chamber, the Queen sits alone, her hand resting on a quill, the candlelight flickering over her face. Outside, rain falls on London roofs. Inside, the silence is thick with thought. She looks up from her writing, and for just a moment, you can see not the ruler, not the legend, but the tired woman beneath it all. The one who carried the weight of a nation and learned how to make it look effortless. She smiles faintly, as if she knows someone far in the future is still awake, still listening. And maybe she does, because history has a way of finding those who stay up late to remember it. The night after a long reign is always the quietest. No proclamations, no council meetings, no applause, just stillness. And in that stillness, time itself seems to pause, as if the world is waiting for permission to move on. Elizabeth had been many things to many people: a savior, a tyrant, a symbol, a mystery. But as centuries passed, she became something simpler, a story whispered through generations. The girl who became a queen, The queen who became a legend, the legend who became a dream. It's easy to forget, when you look at the portraits, that she was ever human. Those paintings, the stiff gowns, the golden halos, the frozen stare make her seem carved from marble. But beneath the layers of silk and ceremony was a woman who felt cold and hungry and lonely, and who sometimes woke in the dark wondering if she had done enough. That's the version of Elizabeth we rarely see. Not the warrior queen or the icon, but the quiet one, the reader, the thinker, the survivor. The one who, after everyone left the hall, would sit by the fire and watch the flames dance, thinking of everything she had lost and everything she had built. She had ruled with steel, yes, but she had also ruled with imagination, because fear alone doesn't hold a kingdom, stories do. And Elizabeth told the greatest story of them, all her own. Imagine her now, long after the world has forgotten her voice. She walks through a misty garden, the dawn light turning the air to silver. The roses have begun to bloom again, pale and delicate. A robin lands near her feet. The crown is gone. Her dress is simple, her hair loose. She kneels by a pool of water and sees her reflection. For the first time in a lifetime, there's no mask, no audience, no danger, just peace. She smiles, not the practiced smile of a queen, but the small, honest smile of someone who's finally free. The world she left behind moved on, of course. New kings, new wars, new ages came and went, but her presence lingered, like perfume in an empty room. Every time England looked to the sea, every time it spoke of pride, power, or identity, there she was quietly guiding it, like a ghost steering the wind. She had become England's mirror, and when the country looked into it, it saw courage, beauty, and just a touch of danger. History can be cruel to its subjects, but with Elizabeth, it became strangely kind. It polished her flaws into legends, her choices into destiny. Her contradictions became her crown. And maybe that's what she wanted all along, to be remembered not as perfect, but as unforgettable. The candle by her window burns low. The quill falls from her hand. The page before her is half written, a few words trailing off mid-sentence. I have done what I could, and maybe that's enough. Because in the end, every ruler, every poet, every dreamer leaves their work unfinished. And history, kind or not, finishes the rest. Now, the room is dark. Outside, dawn is breaking. The soft bells of London begin to toll slow, rhythmic, gentle. The city stretches, unaware that its queen has slipped quietly into history's embrace. And somewhere in that golden haze between night and morning, you can almost hear her whisper, "We are such stuff as dreams are made on." The words are Shakespeare's, but the feeling is hers. So, as you lie here, drifting in the same slow rhythm as the centuries, let her story settle softly in your mind. The fear, the brilliance, the silence, the crown, the flame, the end. She was England's most feared ruler, but maybe that fear was just another kind of love. A love wrapped in awe, in distance, in the kind of respect that only silence can earn. And as sleep begins to take you, remember that even legends must rest. Even queens, even you. The candle goes out. The last breath of the old age fades, and all that's left is peace. The end.